Margaret had always believed that love, once promised, never truly faded. At 72, her body had grown slower, her hair silver, and her hands weaker, but her heart still carried decades of memories, shared meals, quiet laughter, and nights spent believing she was safe beside the man she married. She never imagined that one ordinary morning would quietly begin the end of the life she knew. That morning started like many others. The house was unusually silent. No familiar footsteps. No greeting from her husband, Richard. When she walked into the living room, two strangers were sitting there well-dressed, polite, and distant. One of them smiled softly and explained they were from a care assistance service. Margaret didn't understand at first. She laughed nervously, assuming there had been some mistake. But then Richard appeared, standing near the doorway, avoiding her eyes. He told her it was for her own good. He said she was forgetting things, that she was becoming a burden, that a care home would be safer. His words sounded rehearsed, almost practiced. Margaret tried to speak, but her voice failed her. No one had asked her opinion. No one had listened. Within an hour, her suitcase was packed not by her, but for her. Photos she loved were left behind. Jewelry passed down from her mother was ignored. She was escorted out of her own home, as if she no longer belonged there. As the door closed behind her, Margaret looked back one last time, hoping Richard would stop this madness. He didn't. The care home was clean, quiet, and cold in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. The staff were polite, but distant. Days blended into nights. Margaret sat near a window most afternoons, watching birds land on the fence, wondering how a life shared for 50 years could end without a single honest conversation. At first, she blamed herself. Maybe she had been too slow. Maybe she had forgotten small things. Maybe she truly was in the way. Those thoughts haunted her until one afternoon, when a nurse noticed something strange. The nurse had asked for Margaret's emergency documents. When reviewing them, she paused. Something didn't add up. According to the file, Margaret had signed consent forms approving her placement. But the signature looked wrong. Too sharp. Too rushed. Not like the gentle handwriting Margaret used when she wrote letters. The nurse gently asked Margaret if she remembered signing anything. Margaret shook her head. Fear and confusion filled her eyes. That moment, small and quiet, was the first crack in the carefully built lie. Over the next few days, the nurse contacted the administration. A review was opened. Margaret, for the first time since being sent away, felt like someone was actually listening. She told them everything: how she had been taken without explanation, how she never agreed to leave, how her husband controlled all finances and paperwork. The investigation uncovered more than anyone expected. Richard had recently transferred ownership of the house into his name alone. Margaret's personal savings account had been emptied. Her pension had been redirected. And the care home placement, it had been arranged hastily, using forged consent and false medical claims. What Margaret didn't know was that Richard had already started a new life. While she sat quietly in a care home room, he was hosting dinners, laughing freely, and telling neighbors that his wife had declined rapidly and needed full-time care. He played the role of a tired, devoted husband perfectly. But lies have a short life. The care home administration contacted legal authorities. An official report was filed. Margaret was examined by an independent doctor who confirmed she was mentally capable, aware, and had no condition requiring forced placement. That report changed everything. One morning, Margaret was called into the office. A calm-voiced officer introduced himself. He explained, slowly and clearly, that what happened to her was not only wrong, it was illegal. Her husband had abused legal authority and committed fraud. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time in weeks, She felt something stronger than sadness, clarity. She chose to go home. But she didn't go alone. The day Margaret returned, a police vehicle stopped in front of the house she had once been forced to leave. Officers stepped out calmly. Margaret followed, standing taller than she had in years. Richard opened the door, smiling at first, until he saw the uniforms. The smile disappeared. The officers explained the situation. They listed the findings: forged documents, financial manipulation, unlawful placement. Richard tried to argue, but his voice cracked. His story fell apart under simple questions. Margaret watched quietly as her husband of 5 decades was asked to step aside. Inside the house, everything looked the same, but felt different. Margaret noticed details she had ignored before: locked drawers, missing documents, empty spaces where her belongings once were. The officers continued their work. Bank records were frozen. Property ownership was reviewed. Margaret was officially reinstated as the legal co-owner of her home and finances. By evening, Richard was escorted away for further questioning. Margaret stood in the doorway, alone in the silence that once scared her. But this time it didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. In the days that followed, Margaret made choices she had postponed her entire life. She met with lawyers. She spoke openly about what happened. She reconnected with old friends who had been told she was too sick to visit. She learned something important through all of it. Being quiet does not mean being powerless. Margaret did not seek revenge. She sought dignity. She chose to live independently on her terms. The house was rearranged. The locks were changed. The walls, once heavy with unspoken control, felt lighter. Months later, Margaret volunteered at a community center, speaking gently to others about knowing their rights, about asking questions, about trusting their instincts even late in life. Her story spread not as gossip, but as a warning and a lesson. Age does not erase worth. Marriage does not excuse control. Silence does not mean consent. And sometimes, the quietest person in the room returns, not with anger, but with truth, law, and courage. Weeks later, Margaret received a handwritten letter. It was from Richard. The words inside were careful and apologetic, but empty. For the first time, she read them without fear or guilt. She folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer, not as forgiveness, but as closure. Life, she realized, did not end when trust was broken. It simply changed direction. Each morning, she brewed her own tea, opened her curtains, and chose peace over bitterness. The past no longer controlled her future. She had returned not just with police, but with her voice, her freedom, and the quiet strength to begin again.